Hello everyone, Sientir here with another Rambler for you, and today continues the 7 Deadly Sins series. Today we're talking about greed, as that's where it falls alphabetically. And I want to start, as I typically do these, with kind of defining how I'm going to approach the concept of greed. It's another one of those ideas that can be used in a number of different ways as a term, as a word. Greed can be applied to a number of different things, and I want to make sure that I'm creating a clear delineation between greed and other 7 deadly sins. Notably, envy tends to be conceptually in a similar place, or they can be seen fairly similarly. And also the way that I would address something like gluttony also can have semblances of greed to it. So when I think about greed, I think about it as having, about needing to have, to possess things. So I contrast this with gluttony, which is about consumption in my mind. Gluttony wants to consume things, greed wants to have them. Not necessarily do anything with them, but just having them is what's important to it. And I think what's important here with greed is why it wants to have stuff. I view greed as wanting to own or possess things because that allows it to feel that it has worth or value. In other words, I would say that greed pins its worth or value on its possessions, on what it has, on having money or power or some sort of possession, even some other person potentially. I would consider things like a trophy wife, for example, with my invisible air quote fingers. I would view that as potentially under greed. I do want to differentiate it from pride. I think that pride feels that it should have stuff because it's owed it. Greed wants stuff because it needs to have it to feel that it has value. I think it's very important here, though, to make a very clear distinction between greed and envy. Envy wants to have stuff that other people have because it wants to be the other person. It doesn't feel that it itself has value, and it wants to try to be someone else. Greed wants things to feel that it has value, and there's a difference here between wanting to be someone else and wanting to make yourself have value by what you have. So this desire to have things it's really important to understand why the person wants the thing, the wealth, the power, whatever. If they want it to feel that they themselves have worth because they have it, that would be greed. If they want it to consume it, that would be gluttony. If they want it to try to be someone else, that is envy. If they think that they ought to have it because they feel owed it, that is probably pride. So this is one of those things where there's a lot of ways that this can be, at least the way that I'm looking at it, can be misconstrued or misunderstood. And this need to feel self-worth or self-value, is very dangerous. It's very destructive because it creates a certain amount of paranoia around things like theft or the loss of possessions. It also makes somebody's sense of self-value or confidence very fragile. If they don't have, and if they're not accumulating more, then they can feel very much so like they don't have value anymore, or that their life has lost meaning. If somebody who has this greed mindset loses all of their possessions, then they've lost all that they are. They no longer perceive themselves as having any sort of value. And it also means that they're very susceptible to gift-based flattery. Bribes can be very powerful with this sort of person. They often won't have integrity because of their greed. And it's just a very sad state, because this is the sort of intrinsic worthlessness that somebody's trying to pile things into. It's this pit of worthlessness that the greed is trying to fill by having. It's trying to say, if I throw enough stuff into this pit, I can eventually no longer be stuck in it. And that's not a healthy place to be. That's a very sad place to be. That's a place where they're very fragile, they're easily paranoid, they're constantly going to be worrying about all of these possessions. Their life is wrapped up in this having, this possessing. It's just a very sad state for someone to be in. You can kind of recognize this, by the way. Just give some examples. This is where somebody thinks that they have meaning by for example, the clothing that they wear. Saying, if I have this particular clothing, then that makes me someone. or I'm someone because of the size of my TV, or the size of my bank account. How much money they have is how much man they are. How big their paycheck is how much of a person they are. And this can be very reductive as well. To evaluate the worth of a person on these sorts of lines, on these material lines like this, is extremely reductive of who a human being is. It undervalues people in general. And that's the problem with the greed-based mindset, is everything needs to be measurable in this way. And in many regards, it's about trying to be at the top through having the biggest measurements in these sorts of wealth-waving contests, as it were. And it's just so reductive. It misses out on so much value that's incalculable, that you can't put a price tag on. And I just don't have much else that I can say about it besides calling it sad. It is sad. It's empty. It's ultimately very empty. So what needs to fill that is a true sense of self-worth, of self-value. And it's not easy. It's difficult. I do want to, by the way, add that it's very possible for people to have low self-worth without having greed or envy, for that matter, creep into it. It's very possible for someone to approach things from a different sort of angle. And I'll probably talk about some of that at some other point in time. But greed or envy or things like these, they're not inevitable outcomes of low self-worth. They're just different ways that low self-worth can be attempted to be dealt with, either by trying to have more stuff, to feel like the value of the stuff. A way to look at it is, because people have attributed some sort of value to stuff, the desirability of that stuff then is a proxy for the desirability of its possessor. That's how greed looks at it. It says, if the stuff that I have is valuable because I have it, it makes me valuable by proxy. And that is very dangerous, but it's also very seductive, because it makes it seem like there's a shortcut to feeling valuable if the person doesn't actually feel valuable themselves. And there's lots of reasons why somebody can be made to not feel valuable. A lot of very destructive things can happen to cause that. A lot of abuse can cause that. And greed can become a response to that, of saying, because I have this thing of value that people have attributed money value to, it has value. Therefore, I have value, and it's kind of this whole sort of proxy chain of effectively turning desirability, kind of perceived desirability, translating that to the possessor of the desirable thing. And this also tends to lead to a lot of very possessive sort of effects. It can impact negatively relationships very badly, especially if somebody is looking at those relationships as a way of having perceived value, of saying, oh, everybody wants to have this sort of relationship, and because I have this relationship that other people want to be able to have, the value of other people wanting that makes me valuable. It's this very demented sort of transference of value that's maybe not quite right. It doesn't change anything about the person with greed, but it makes them think that there's a difference. It also, unfortunately, probably means that the person with greed does not have, for whatever reason, an underlying sense of the intrinsic worth of human life. Because if they intrinsically felt that their life was valuable, just as is, because they're alive, because they're a human being, then greed doesn't really have the ability to kind of get its claws in there. At least this form of greed that I'm talking about. So that's kind of the way that this draws out or manifests, I think. And so I think I've covered this particular topic in terms of the ideas that I have on it. So I'd be curious to hear what you think. And again, I'm not talking about greed in sort of the common sense, but more of a specific sense here. So I've hopefully conveyed what I'm thinking about and what I've thought about this and that whole thing. So until next time, everyone, I invite you to like me on Facebook at facebook.com/SientiersRamblers. I invite you to email me if you have anything you want to say directly to me personally. You can email me at sientir@gmail.com. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Sientir. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.